When Gregor Robertson was mayor of Vancouver, they increased local charges and fees over 100% on housing, and I actually asked him this question in a committee, and I said, what makes you think that that made sense? And his response was telling. I mean, he's a very left-leaning politician. He believes in big government. His response was along the lines of, well, these developers were making so much money, the city had to get its piece.
Welcome back to Northern Perspective, everyone. We have a very special guest for the first time in studio today. We have been talking about the fact that Canada is in the midst of a mortgage crisis, whether the federal government wants to admit it or not. They keep promising new homes, but the more promises they make, it seems the less houses actually get built. And the gentleman that we're having a sit down and chat with today is the expert from the Conservatives, the Shadow Minister of Housing, Scott Aitchison. Scott, welcome to Northern Perspective.
Ryan, thanks for having me. Honestly, I can tell you right now, I feel very special because this is great to be here. I've wanted to come on for a while.
Amazing. Well, we're honored to have you. I can say that.
Thank you.
So let's just get right into this, because it's an issue that Canadians have been facing for years now. It's been called out in the Trudeau government. They've been spending billions and billions on new housing bureaucracies. And that's not just a slogan, that's an actual fact.
Yeah.
And when Sean Fraser became Minister of Housing, it got worse, and now we have Mark Carney's government coming in. Why do you think the Liberal plan, seemingly on everything, but especially housing, is they think that they can spend their way out of trouble?
Well, I mean, very more broadly, I think it's quintessentially a liberal thing, right? Conservatives believe in, small, efficient, effective government, whereas liberals, there's no such thing as a problem that they don't think some new government bureaucracy can't fix. And so that's their approach to governing. They think that if they're not spending money or creating something or announcing something, then they're not solving a problem. The solution to the housing crisis that we face in this country right now is the most quintessentially small c conservative solution out there. It's less government. That's a very, very broad statement to say, but the reality is that governments at the federal, provincial, and local level make it difficult and expensive to build homes. And fundamentally, we need to reduce the burden of government on that construction. And so this is why Pierre has called, for some time now on things like eliminating the GST on all new homes under $1.3 million. When the GST was first in place, GST wasn't charged on new homes under $450,000. And of course, at that time, the average house in Canada cost a little less than $200,000. So it effectively didn't charge. It was a luxury tax on homes. And it was supposed to be indexed. It said right in the document that the government will need to revisit this regularly to index it for inflation. That never happened. And now, since that time, I think, conservatively, you could say that the federal government has collected probably $40 billion on new homes. And so this is, to me, the height of sanctimony. The Liberals pass a motion in the House of Commons declaring that housing is a human right, and yet we tax it like we do cigarettes and alcohol.
Right, and that's an interesting point, because on a lot of the food that we buy, GST is not on foods.
On real food, that's right. Yeah.
Because it's an essential, right? Yeah. So it's very kind of two-faced and tongue-in-cheek of them to say, oh, well, it's a human right, but, apparently we get to tax all the human rights that you have. So,
but here's the other problem with the Liberals, of course, is that what they're very focused on, of course, is what they broadly refer to as affordable housing. So you said it very accurately. I mean, they've done nothing but create new bureaucracies, and we thought that maybe Prime Minister Carney would be a little bit different. He would understand the problem, but he's created a fourth federal housing bureaucracy. So the Build Canada Homes, which they've just turned into a Crown Corporation, is the fourth federal housing agency. It's the third Crown Corporation that they've created for housing at the federal level.
Have the other ones been decommissioned or no?
No, they still exist. So the first Crown Corporation in housing was the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. And of course, it solved the crisis back after the war, and it did so by mobilizing the private sector and getting things built. It built, these great homes that were, not too big, but they built whole communities, whole suburbs and whole communities very quickly. In 10 years, we had the problem solved. Honestly, there was nowhere near the level of taxation on housing back then, of course. They didn't have to go 8 rounds with the local municipality to get approvals. It didn't take 6 years to get the subdivision approved. They just built and they got it done. CMHC has evolved over time and become, less of a builder, obviously. And for the last, number of years, it really was focused very much on just, mortgage insurance and research. And so that's what it did. And then along came the Trudeau government, and following up and building upon the work that the Harper government had started. Prime Minister Harper understood that housing was becoming a bigger issue, particularly homelessness and housing precarity. People were precariously housed, and he recognized that there was a problem coming. And so they came up with something called Housing First, recognizing that the federal government needed to be involved again. But the Justin Trudeau government came along and created something called the National Housing Strategy, building upon that, which was a commitment of, when the number changed regularly as they announced it. It was started out at, sort of $15 or $16 billion. And by the end, I think it was something like $80 billion. And of course, in that time frame from 2017 to today, house prices have doubled, rent has doubled, and all that kind of stuff. So, but they focused very much on government building as opposed to getting out of the way and reducing the burden of government on private sector builders. This is the problem. 95% of all housing in this country is market-driven housing. And they think that the only problem that we have is with affordable housing and social and supportive housing. There's no question that we need more social and supportive housing in this country. We do need more. But if you ignore 95% of all housing and that part of the housing continuum, you're just making it harder to get the social and supportive housing built. So yes, we need more affordable housing, but fundamentally what we need is all homes to be more affordable. And the best way you can do that is to reduce the burden of government. In Ontario today, and I know you're watched across the country, but Ontario is a good example. 30% of the cost of all new homes, on average, 30% of that price tag is government taxes, charges, and fees.
That's all levels of government.
All levels of government. And so this has been the Conservative approach, to reduce the burden of government and then to leverage the local municipalities who charge huge fees on it as well in places like the GTA and the Lower Mainland of BC to reduce their charges and their processes. Because time is money, right? Developers, everybody says, oh, the developer can pay that, developer can pay that. Well, it's not the way it works, right? It goes to the bottom line. It goes to the purchase price of the house or the rent. And so Pierre's whole approach, which I obviously fully 1,000,000% endorse, it was brilliant, is to reduce the burden of the federal government, but also reduce the burden of the local government by using federal infrastructure dollars to tie directly to housing results. The Liberal approach was to build more bureaucracy, to create new programs that they would give money to municipal governments based on their promises to do better. And so things like the Housing Accelerator Fund was another multi-billion-dollar fund that they gave to cities based on commitments that they made to do various different things. And then when they don't do those things, they kind of get their wrist slapped, but they still get their money. And it's just more taxpayers' dollars rewarding the worst of the gatekeepers.
Well, and that was the really frustrating thing of watching these announcements come out in the Trudeau government, because they kept using these terms like we're unlocking, as trying to pass it off as there was all these houses hidden behind this locked door and we're coming in with the key and unlocking them. But following up on something you said about the Harper government, that must have been very challenging evaluating the housing portfolio in the Harper government. And I know Pierre was housing minister for a little while, because the Harper government was still dealing with the worldwide recession of the housing crash in 2008. So I know you have to let that market kind of stabilize to understand where the real affordability level is there. So it must have been very difficult to decide what policy to enact and what levers to pull as that market was stabilizing, because that doesn't happen in a year. It happens, probably over 5 or 6 years. So, how do you look at that period of market destabilization and even leading up to 2008 and where we're at now? Because we're seeing we're seeing some worrying signs come out of the GTA, especially. Housing sales are down, like, I think it was, in one stat, it was like 80% year over year. I know people in the real estate business, and they're talking about people selling at $200,000-$300,000 losses because they need to get out of these mortgages. Like, how do you see this playing out if the government does not change their approach?
Yeah, I think those are all great questions, and it's important, I think, to understand the historical context of the crisis that we're in today. And the reality of it is that the current crisis, its roots really are in the late 70s. This was an era when Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau decided that tax incentive programs to encourage Canadians to invest in rental housing, building rental housing, and to encourage those builders to reinvest those dollars into more rental housing was called the MERB program. And it was actually a very effective program. It built literally thousands and thousands and thousands of purpose-built rental units, which the market needed. And you can see them all over, like particularly, parts of Hamilton, parts of Toronto. They have a certain age to them, right? They're from the late 60s, early 70s. But once the Trudeau government stopped that program, that all of a sudden investment in purpose-built rentals kind of dried up because it just, the math didn't work anymore. But Pierre Trudeau felt that it was important for the government to start building housing. Of course, a Liberal thinks that the government should build your house for you. They can't deliver a passport, but they can build you a house somehow. And so as a result of that, they started into that process. But then the economy, global economy, took a hit. And the first thing they stopped spending money on was building housing. And so as a result, the crisis really started right there. And so the federal governments, the end of the Trudeau era, they were spending less and less and less, were investing less on housing. The Mulroney government, continued to wind things down. And by the time the Chrétien-Martin era came along, the federal government was investing no money whatsoever. They were doing nothing related to housing. No investments or supports for provincial work on social and supportive housing, that kind of stuff. They were doing nothing. And it wasn't until Stephen Harper that the federal government realized we need to show some leadership here and get back into this. But Prime Minister Harper focused very specifically on the most vulnerable in our society, which is what we needed to do at the time. Keeping in mind that when Prime Minister Harper, when he was in office, the average home price in Canada was less than half of what it is today. So the Liberals love to talk about Pierre was housing minister. There wasn't really a full-fledged housing portfolio when Pierre was housing minister. It was part of a portfolio. That's because it wasn't as big an issue then. There was a recognition that we needed to do something for the most vulnerable in our society, and that was less about housing than it was about social supports and working with the provinces to make sure that those supports existed. And so, no, Pierre didn't build all kinds of housing because he's a conservative and believes that the private sector should build the vast majority of housing. And Prime Minister Harper understood the importance of respecting divisional rules and supporting the provincial governments in their work to make sure that the social supports were in place to support people that needed help, that were precariously housed or not housed at all. So fast forward, now you get to Justin Trudeau, who believes in big government. They decriminalized and made it possible to, the whole safe supply experiment, which exacerbated problems. They made safe supply is such a misnomer. I know you understand that, of course. But this whole experiment they did, they kept talking about it being based on the program in Portugal. But of course, the problem there is that, just giving out free drugs, but not using those drugs as part of a treatment program is not like the Portuguese program at all.
Yeah, the
it's
Portugal
quite the opposite,
model,
right?
Yeah, you had to do certain things.
Absolutely.
Otherwise,
Yeah.
you would be, there would be consequences to it. So yeah, we looked into that as well. The whole Portugal model bit is just, it's a non sequitur. Just
right. And so Stephen Harper was actually starting to do some work to support homeless issues and people who are homeless, and working with the provinces to do that. And once again, Justin Trudeau came in and just his policies exacerbated the problem dramatically and made people more homeless. Now add COVID into the mix, and there was a whole new series of problems related to it. And as we can see in our cities and our communities, large and small across the country, homelessness is an epidemic in this country now. And it's getting worse because big government, as it turns out, can't be all things to all people. And this is something conservatives have said all along. So there's no question we need more investment in social and supportive housing, and certainly investment in treatment for drug addictions and addictions generally, and getting people healthy and well. Pierre talks about that a lot as well. But again, when it comes to housing, government investment in that segment of the market, or that segment of the housing continuum where the market will simply cannot do anything, is important. But the most important thing government can do on housing, 95% of the continuum, is get out of the way.
Yeah, and so to sum up the conservative housing strategy, if a conservative government was in power today, it sounds like the approach would be, in terms of the actual market, stay out of the market and get governments out of the market. So you reduce the actual cost of housing. I believe one of the fundraisers I was at with you recently, they were talking about the fact if you get rid of these development charges, it would take off $300,000 off of the cost of a house. That all of a sudden puts many families who are in the unaffordable bucket now in the affordable bucket of buying a house.
Right.
Now you have more families that are actually able to buy houses. That creates more incentive for developers to build more houses, and then the government can focus on where it is actually needed, which is the affordability housing sector. Is that fair?
That's absolutely fair. I mean, if the federal government was not spending gobs of money on market housing, if they weren't spending all kinds of money creating new bureaucracies, they could use those scarce public funds to invest directly in social and supportive housing, which there's a need for, and treatment for addiction centers. But instead, they keep building these bureaucracies. And keep in mind, one of the other crown corporations they have at the federal level was something called the Canada Lands Company. Canada Lands Company was created just after Prime Minister Mulroney privatized CN Rail. And so when CN Rail was privatized, there was a number of assets from the corporation that the government felt should remain in public hands. CN Tower as a tourist example, and the Port of Montreal is another example, and the Downsview lands. There's a few examples. And so it was created to manage and operate those. But then, at some point during its history, the federal government decided actually it could be a development arm. Take federal lands and develop housing and communities on these lands. Canada Lands Company was reasonably good at that. They had their hiccups. But their biggest hiccups, their biggest challenges were, number one, getting federal land. The process for the federal government to dispose of a piece of land or a building, on average, takes about 10 years. To sell it to itself, it takes that long. So there's all kinds of examples in Ottawa right now where Canada Lands Company has developed or is in the process of trying to develop former federal properties that are in, either a state of disrepair, they're just not needed anymore. And they're decades in the making. So they finally get the land from the federal government, and they have to pay market price for it as well, too. So the federal government is charging its own crown corporation market price. And then they go all the different rounds of planning and approvals and studies and all that kind of stuff with the local municipality. In Ottawa, that's a big project. But then on top of that, in Ottawa, they also have to do the exact same process they did with the City of Ottawa with the National Capital Commission, which is an incredibly secretive organization that no transparency about how they work. And so this is why, for example, there's a project on Heron Road. It used to be a training center that the government had. So they would fly people in for training into Ottawa, and they decided that wasn't an effective way to do that anymore. So they decided they wouldn't. 16 years. It's been sitting empty for 16 years while their own crown corporation works to try to redevelop it. Now we know why government shouldn't build housing.
Government shouldn't do a lot of things, but housing is at the top of the list. Now, so why? I guess it's frustrating for Canadians because they keep hearing these announcements, and it's announcement after announcement after announcement. Mark Carney says they're going to build 500,000 homes. Meanwhile, his own government agencies are releasing data that shows that we're actually going to be building less homes this year than last year. So How are Canadians supposed to reconcile the announcement versus the data that's coming out of Carney's own government?
Yeah, well, I think it's important for Canadians to recognize that they some of them may like Mark Carney and they think he's not Justin Trudeau. At the end of the day, a Liberal government is a Liberal government. They are very good at announcing. They're very good at photo ops. They're very good at making you feel like they're doing something. You just ask them, they spent this much money. But when it comes to delivery, they are really bad at that. They're really bad at that. And housing is just one of the most glaring examples of it. I mentioned earlier that I thought maybe Prime Minister Carney sort of understood the issue during the election campaign because he talked about things like reducing development charges, getting them cut in half, and reducing the burden of government generally. He seemed to be speaking, kind of our language a little bit. And yet he just spent the last year wasting time and resources, not just building a fourth federal housing, the Build Canada Homes Agency, which he's now turned into a Crown Corporation. He created this thing, or he has been creating this thing. They spent millions and millions of dollars establishing this new bureaucracy. Now we have a situation where all kinds of private sector proponents for, mixed use residential buildings with some affordable and deeply affordable, looking for, competitive financing through CMHC, which is a great tool, and I really encourage more of that. All of a sudden we're told, you need to send your application now to Build Canada Homes. And Build Canada Homes wasn't really ready for it all, so they've got a mountain of applications sitting there, and they're trying to figure out how to deal with that. Nobody really knows who does what anymore. We're still not entirely sure what Build Canada Homes will actually do, other than we know they're going to catalyze the construction of below market housing. But we don't know much more than that. People have forgotten that, the CMHC still exists. The folks at Canada Lands Company didn't really know what was going on either. Now I'm led to believe that in fact what will happen is their development arm that was established and created and nurtured over the last couple of decades will actually be taken over by Build Canada Homes, and Canada Lands Company will just go back to managing a couple of tourist attractions. And so now so not only have they created a new bureaucracy, now they're rearranging the deck chairs on the bureaucratic boat. And no more homes are getting built. In fact, starts are down. Housing Minister Gregor Robertson stands in the House of Commons and brags about housing starts being up. And this is one of the duplicitous ways that they speak. They speak in this way because if you look at housing completions, let's imagine for a moment a multi-unit, 10, 15-story building, for example. That takes a few years to build, right? And so you have examples in, let's say the Lower Mainland, Vancouver area, where there's builders who are finishing projects because when they started them, the math made sense, but it no longer does. And so they told me last year that you'll see probably 20,000 units come on the market in the next couple of years each, right? And so the Liberals are talking about those being starts, right? Oh, we started these homes. Once they come out of the ground, they've started. The real measure of this, though, is how many new holes are getting dug. How many homes are being started? And that number is down.
And that was fascinating because we looked into when they were talking about that as well, and there was this flurry of activity, especially around COVID.
Yeah.
And so people put down their deposits and they wait for things to get built. So now the Liberals are trying to take credit for all of these homes that were actually started years and years ago.
Yeah.
When in actuality, to your point, there's no new holes being dug, and that's the problem.
Yeah.
And that's where Canadians are, I think, having trouble. So,
and this is another important point to acknowledge too, though, that there's no one single housing market in Canada, right? I mean, it is different depending on which part of the country you're in. And so the epicenter of the crisis is, in fact, the GTA, the Greater Golden Horseshoe, really, and the Lower Mainland of BC.
Yep.
Not surprisingly, these are the regions of the country where municipal charges are the absolute highest, and the timelines to get approvals are the absolute longest.
And Gregor Robertson was mayor over in Vancouver.
When Gregor Robertson was mayor of Vancouver, they increased local charges and fees over 100% on housing, and I actually asked him this question in a committee, and I said, you know, what makes you think that that made sense? And his response was telling. I mean, he's a very left-leaning politician. He believes in big government. His response was along the lines of, well, you know, these developers were making so much money, the city had to get its piece. And they see this, they see housing, they see new homes as a cash cow.
So that's an incredible admission, because that essentially says you're gouging the customer and getting a bunch of money. We wanted to gouge them as well.
Yeah,
Wow.
and honestly, like, you know, it's an incredible mission to you and I, because we recognize the hypocrisy of it, calling it a human right and then taxing it that way. But he doesn't see it that way. He genuinely thinks that, you know, like the municipal governments should be taxing that to make sure that they're getting as much taxation revenue as they can possibly out of anything good. I remember Ronald Reagan used to have this expression, you know, when the government, I can't remember, I won't do it justice, but he says, you know, the government sees something successful, they tax it. When it starts to fail, they subsidize it. And when it completely fails, you know, they take it over and do it themselves. But this is what these guys are up to.